Emergentism and Reductionism, a Mystrikal Perspective. Part 1 of 11. Picture standing on the edge of a vast forest at twilight as the last beams of sunlight filter through the branches. Here, in the interplay of shadows and light, lies a question that has long captivated human thought. How does a universe composed of simple particles give rise to minds, morals, and meaning? Mystrikism, a modern secular philosophy grounded in rational naturalism and scientific inquiry, offers a distinctive perspective on this mystery. While it embraces the scientific conviction that all phenomena have natural explanations, it also champions a sense of awe, what Mystrikal and Phil Zuckerman, the sociologist who coined the term, call aurism, toward the intricate complexities of life and the cosmos. In exploring emergentism and reductionism, Mystrikism acknowledges that many lofty phenomena appear greater than the sum of their parts, while insisting that even the most emergent marvels ultimately arise from, and are explainable by, simpler natural components. This treatise delves into Mystrikism's view of emergent and reductionist thinking, from consciousness and biology to society, morality, and physics, blending scientific clarity with the sense of humanistic awe exemplified by thinkers like Carl Sagan and Bertrand Russell. In doing so, we will see how Mystrikism harmonizes the poetic wonder of the whole with the logical understanding of the parts, all while staying true to its credo: nothing supernatural required, but an open heart and mind essential. Two lenses on complexity. Emergentism is the philosophical idea that complex systems can exhibit properties their individual parts do not possess, a point Aristotle famously expressed as, "The whole is greater than the sum of its parts." This means that when many components interact, new patterns or behaviors can emerge that one would not predict just by examining each element in isolation. A classic example is simple. A single water molecule is not wet, yet the collective behavior of countless molecules gives rise to water's wetness. Likewise, individual neurons in a brain are just cells firing electrical impulses, but together they produce the emergent phenomenon of consciousness. A single ant is a simple creature, but an entire colony can manifest complex, colony-wide behaviors like building bridges or regulating nest temperature. Consider, too, the movement patterns on a crowded highway. Each car is driven by an individual following simple traffic rules, yet together they create dynamic traffic waves that ebb and flow unpredictably. This everyday example can help us relate to emergentism as we observe traffic slowdowns that arise seemingly without cause. Emergentism draws our attention to these novel properties that materialize at higher levels of organization in biology, mind, society, and beyond, suggesting that something new and meaningful emerges that cannot be fully captured by reduction to the parts alone. It's a perspective that celebrates complexity and often cautions us that understanding a system may require looking at relations, patterns, and wholes, not just atoms and equations. Reductionism, on the other hand, is the view and scientific method that any complex phenomenon can be understood by breaking it down into its constituent parts and simpler interactions. In practice, reductionism is what has driven much of science's success. We explain the behavior of a cell by understanding its molecules. We explain molecules by the atoms that compose them, and we explain atoms by subatomic particles and forces. Notable scientific milestones exemplify the power of reductionism, such as the discovery of DNA's double helical structure, which unraveled the code of life at the molecular level, and the identification of the Higgs boson, which supported the standard model of particle physics. The reductionist lens seeks the fundamental building blocks and principles underlying the complexity. As a philosophical stance, reductionism holds that no mysterious extra ingredients are needed once you've accounted for the parts in their arrangement. The whole is the sum of its parts operating together. A strong reductionist would argue that even phenomena like consciousness or love are nothing but the interplay of neurons, hormones, and physics. Critics sometimes caricature this as a machine-like or overly simplistic view of life, one that, if taken naively, might miss the forest for the trees. But in its nuanced form, reductionism doesn't deny the beauty of the forest. It simply says the beauty comes from the trees and their interactions. The Nobel laureate physicist Philip Anderson captured this tension in the title of his famous essay, More is Different, acknowledging that while new phenomena arise at higher levels, they ultimately stem from lower-level laws. In short, reductionism gives us explanatory power by drilling down to basics, and emergentism reminds us that knowing the pieces isn't always the same as appreciating the patterned tapestry they form. These two perspectives are sometimes cast as opposites. One asks, how do the parts produce the whole? And the other asks, why does the whole not feel like just the parts? Yet, as we shall see, Mystrikism finds these lenses compatible and complementary. The emergent properties are real and wondrous, but not mystical. The reductionist explanation is essential, but without losing the sense of awe they inspire. By understanding both concepts clearly, we set the stage for Mystrikism's balanced worldview, one that uses reductionist science to demystify the world while still reveling in the emergent splendor of nature's complexity. Emergentism and Reductionism, a Mystrikal Perspective, Part 2 of 11. Naturalism, Awe, and the Infinite Unknown. Before examining emergentism and reductionism through a Mystrikal lens, it's crucial to grasp the core principles of Mystrikism that inform its approach. Mystrikism is staunchly naturalistic. It asserts that reality consists solely of the natural world, with no supernatural realms or forces behind the curtain. Every phenomenon, from the tiniest quark to the quilt of galaxies, from the firing of a neuron to the flowering of morality, is part of one natural universe operating by discoverable laws of physics, chemistry, and biology. Nothing is beyond nature, a Mystrik might say, meaning not that we currently know everything, but that we trust whatever exists will ultimately have a natural explanation. This foundational view is encapsulated in 4 interrelated aspects. 1. Metaphysical naturalism. The belief that everything arises from natural properties and causes, with no supernatural elements involved. 2. Methodological naturalism, a commitment to scientific methods and empirical inquiry as the means to understanding reality. 3. Epistemological naturalism, the stance that sound reasoning and data are required before accepting claims about the world. 4. Ethical naturalism, the idea that moral values emerge from natural facts about sentient beings' well-being. By laying out this framework, we establish a roadmap for exploring Mystrikism, making it easier to navigate the intricate discussion that follows. If ghosts or spirits were real and testable, they would just become part of nature's catalog. But until then, Mystriks reserve belief, preferring hypotheses they can scrutinize with evidence. Importantly, Mystrikism couples this scientific rationality with a deep reverence for the unknown. Rather than filling knowledge gaps with supernatural beliefs, Mystriks practically revere the mystery itself, not with literal prayer or personification, but with impersonal respect, awe, and humility. The movement even speaks of the infinite unknown as a kind of metaphorical higher power, not a deity with a mind or will, but a symbolic reminder of how much lies beyond our current understanding. Standing under a starry sky, a Mystrik doesn't feel the need to invoke angels or astrology, yet they do feel a profound sense of wonder and insignificance in the face of an immensely complex cosmos. This emotional posture is what Mystrikism calls orism, finding spiritual, in quotes, depth in natural reality itself. By embracing awe, Mystrikism ensures that a devotion to rationality never calcifies into a cold or cynical outlook. As Carl Sagan beautifully expressed, the beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way those atoms are put together. In other words, understanding that we are just atoms organized by evolution does not diminish the splendor of life. It elevates it by revealing the delicate way those atoms are arranged to create a rose, a whale, or a human mind. Finally, Mystrikism espouses ethical naturalism, holding that moral values arise from natural facts about sentient beings' well-being rather than from any supernatural commandments. We'll explore this more later, but it's key to note that in a Mystrik's eyes, even morality is part of the natural emergent tapestry. Kindness, cooperation, love. These are not ethereal gifts from above, but emergent features of social and biological reality, shaped by evolution and human reason. This means Mystriks look to psychology, sociology, biology, and many other scientific disciplines to inform ethics, treating morality as something to be understood through consequences, suffering or flourishing, rather than as a mysterious doctrine to be obeyed. In summary, the Mystrikal worldview is one of scientific humanism, utterly secular and naturalistic, but spiritually, in quotes, rich in its appreciation of nature's wonders and morally earnest in its commitment to compassion and evidence-based ethics. This worldview sets the stage for how Mystrikism handles the interplay of emergentism and reductionism. With nothing supernatural allowed, any emergent phenomenon must ultimately have a natural explanation. With awe and humility at heart, reductionist explanations are welcomed as deepening our wonder rather than quenching it. Mystrikism seeks cohesion in these principles. As the doctrine puts it, all four facets of naturalism support one another, forming a rational, wonder-filled tapestry of understanding. Against this backdrop, let us see how Mystriks harmonize emergent complexity and reductionist science. Emergentism and Reductionism, a Mystrikal Perspective, Part 3 of 11. Complexity as seeming beyond the sum. To a Mystrik, emergent phenomena are real but not magical. When confronted with something like consciousness, life, or the self-organizing behavior of an ecosystem, things that feel profoundly novel relative to their ingredients, a Mystrik acknowledges the genuine wow factor of such complexity. These phenomena appear greater than the sum of their parts, and it's helpful to label them emergent as a way of saying a lot is going on here that isn't obvious from the parts alone. However, Mystrikism points out the word seems in the phrase greater than the sum, insisting that this impression reflects the current gaps in our understanding rather than any ultimate irreducibility. In other words, emergent is a provisional concept in Mystrikism, a placeholder term we use when we haven't yet fully traced the detailed chain of cause and effect from the parts to the whole. It is an admission of complexity, not a confession of mysticism. To sharpen the distinction between seeming and being, consider a thought experiment where a future AI is capable of fully modeling the complex behaviors of ant colonies. Initially, the colony's coordination and problem-solving abilities might seem greater than those of individual ants, appearing almost magical. However, as the AI models every step, interaction, and influence within the colony, the mystery begins to dissolve, revealing that this complexity indeed arises from the cumulative effects of countless individual actions governed by simple interaction rules. This scenario illustrates that while the emergent qualities are remarkable, they are ultimately explainable by a deeper dive into the underlying systems, reaffirming Mystrikism's stance on emergent phenomena. Mystrikism explicitly rejects ontological emergentism, the philosophical stance that emergent properties are fundamentally new kinds of reality, irreducible to physical components. To claim, for example, that life or mind involves some non-physical essence or a new force beyond physics would violate Mystrikism's naturalism. Instead, Mystriks align with epistemological emergentism, the idea that emergent properties appear irreducible because of the limits of our knowledge or analytical methods at present. This view says, Yes, it looks novel, and we don't yet see exactly how the parts give rise to it, but we expect that with enough scientific progress, those mechanisms will be uncovered. It's a stance of patience and confidence in future understanding. An emergent phenomenon, in this light, is not a miracle. It's a complex puzzle. Consciousness is considered an emergent property of neural activity that can, in principle, be fully explained once all underlying mechanisms are identified. We may not have all the pieces yet. Brain science is still young. However, there is no ghost in the machine, just a very intricate machine we're still learning how to read. By treating emergence as a practical descriptor rather than a metaphysical explanation, Mystrikism maintains intellectual humility without surrendering to mystification. The complexity of, say, an ant colony's behavior is astonishing and not trivial to derive from individual ant rules. In that sense, it's emergent. Mystriks with the know-how happily study emergent systems using systems science, network theory, or holistic models when those are the appropriate tools. But they do so consistently with the underlying conviction that emergent patterns arise from lower-level interactions, regardless of their complexity. As a result, Mystriks often speak of emergent properties with a tone of reverence and determination, reverence for the intricate dance of countless parts that produces, say, a human consciousness, determination that one day, step by step, science will choreograph every step in that dance and demystify it. In the interim, calling something emergent is acceptable shorthand for, we don't yet fully know how X arises from simpler Y, but it is never taken to mean X involves spooky ingredients or breaks the laws of physics. This balanced view allows mystriks to celebrate complexity without idolizing ignorance. There's an almost poetic sentiment here. Each new layer of natural complexity, whether the blooming complexity of a rainforest ecosystem or the collective intelligence of a human society, is seen as an astonishing product of physical processes, no gods required. The more we learn about those processes, the more our awe can increase, not decrease. A great example is how understanding the stars as gigantic nuclear furnaces billions of miles away, a very reductionist astrophysical explanation, makes the night sky more awe-inspiring, not less, because we now perceive the true scale and grandeur of what those pinpoints of light really are. In the same way, mystriks believe that unraveling emergent phenomena scientifically will only deepen our appreciation. As the doctrine notes, rational inquiry doesn't drain the magic from life. Instead, the more we discover, the more extraordinary the universe appears. Emergence, then, is part of the mystery that Mystrikism reveres, but it's a mystery we actively investigate rather than enshrine. Mystriks often say that today's mysteries are tomorrow's knowledge, today's emergent phenomenon is tomorrow's explained mechanism. This optimism is tempered with patience. Nature is infinitely deep, so there will always be emergent layers at the edge of understanding, keeping us humble. The key is that none of those layers is viewed as a supernatural gap. They are natural frontiers. Emergentism and Reductionism, a Mystrikal Perspective, Part 4 of 11. Peering deep without diminishing wonder. If emergentism reminds us to marvel at the complex whole, reductionism is the strategy that Mystrikism uses to probe and understand how those wholes come to be. At its core, Mystrikism is unapologetically reductionistic in its epistemology. This means mystriks operate on the working belief that to explain anything, one should break it down into its fundamental components and causes, and that ultimately, even the highest-level phenomena will yield to such analysis. The doctrine states plainly that Mystrikism aligns with an entirely natural, reductionistic, and explainable universe grounded in logic. This echoes the physicalist conviction that, with infinite knowledge of all particles and forces, nothing in the universe would remain unintelligible or beyond prediction. While we humans don't have that omniscient grasp, the reductionist commitment serves as a guiding principle. No matter how complex or emergent something looks, keep digging, because there is a mechanism under there waiting to be found. One practical example that aligns with Mystrikism's reductionist perspective is the ongoing exploration of consciousness in neuroscience. Future discoveries that pinpoint the precise neural circuits responsible for self-awareness using brain imaging technologies would exemplify this reductionist approach. Similarly, in the realm of cosmology, if future evidence were to support aspects of quantum gravity theories, for example, signs that space-time emerges from deeper quantum processes, that would reinforce Mystrikism's confidence in the power of reductionism to illuminate even the universe's most profound mysteries. However, Mystrikism is careful to distinguish good reductionism from bad reductionism. Bad reductionism would be crudely saying, "Oh, love is just a bunch of chemicals, so it's nothing important," or "Art is nothing but neurons firing, so who cares?" Mystrikal philosophy firmly rejects that dismissive attitude and cherishes love and art as significant human experiences. Understanding the ingredients of life can enhance our appreciation. To paraphrase a common sentiment, knowing that a rose's red color comes from specific molecules and interactions with sunlight doesn't make it less beautiful. If anything, it adds layers to its beauty, linking the rose to the entire tapestry of life. In the words of a famous science communicator, it does no harm to the romance of the sunset to know a little bit about it. This quote, often attributed to Richard Feynman, captures the Mystrikal spirit. Reductionist knowledge and poetic wonder are not enemies, as understanding the electric charges and cloud dynamics behind a thunderstorm enhances rather than diminishes the awe of its display. So what kind of reductionism does Mystrikism advocate? Essentially, it's methodological and epistemological reductionism. Methodological, in that Mystrikal scientists will tackle problems by analyzing components, neurons in a brain, individuals in a society, species in an ecosystem, and looking for bottom-up explanations. Epistemological, in that mystics believe our knowledge is most secure when we can trace phenomena to their simpler elements and verify cause and effect at that level. But Mystrikism stops short of an ontological claim that only the smallest things really exist. It fully acknowledges that higher-level structures are real in their own right. A human being is real and not merely an abstraction of atoms, even if atoms ultimately compose the human. In practical terms, this means mystics use reductionism as a tool, not an ideology, to denigrate the higher levels. They trust in ever more precise reductionist explanations, but also use holistic perspectives as needed without ever invoking mysterious forces. A weather system, for instance, might be studied with holistic models, since it's tough to calculate every molecule. Still, a mystic holds that, in principle, the weather arises from all those molecules obeying physical laws. In Gaia, spirit or external teleology is not guiding the storm, even if we use higher-level models to describe it. Mystrikism's reductionism is encapsulated well by an image. Imagine peeling an infinite onion of nature. Each layer you peel, reducing to smaller scales or simpler components, reveals another layer beneath. The mystic is confident there is no ghost hiding between the layers, no magical core. It's natural onions all the way down, or as far down as reality goes. But importantly, mystics also look at the whole onion and appreciates how those layers come together. In plainer terms, mystics see no conflict between understanding the parts and admiring the whole. They often admire scientists and thinkers who exemplify this unity. For instance, Bertrand Russell combined rigorous logical analysis, reductionist in approach, with lyrical humanism and ethical concern in his writings. As mentioned, Carl Sagan could discuss the biochemical evolution of life, a reductionist account, and yet leave his audience feeling uplifted by how special that makes life, that we are star stuff, turned conscious, a way for the cosmos to know itself. This iconic Sagan idea of "we are made of star stuff" is a perfect mystical example. It's a stark reductionist fact. Our atoms were forged in ancient stars. But it is delivered as a sublime, almost spiritual, in quotes, realization. Reductionism, in the Mystrikal view, doesn't rob us of poetry. It writes poetry in equations and evidence. In practice, then, when a mystrik hears someone claim a phenomenon is irreducibly mysterious, their response is gentle skepticism. They will say, "Perhaps it seems that way now, but history has shown countless mysteries eventually yielding to natural explanation. From the once miraculous phenomenon of combustion, now explained by oxidation chemistry, to the vital force of life, now understood through biology and DNA, time and again, reductionist science has demystified things without destroying their wonder." Mystrikism carries that lesson forward. It encourages trust in the scientific process, not faith in anything supernatural, but faith that patient reductionist inquiry will continue to illuminate the darkest corners of complexity. And until it does, we use terms like emergent or holistic as helpful signposts, but we never treat them as impenetrable walls. In a line from the doctrine, eventually all phenomena, no matter how complex, are expected to yield to ever more precise reductionist explanations. Emergent is merely a provisional term in Mystrikism. The take-home message is clear. Reductionism is the roadmap. Emergentism describes the scenery. Both are true in their way, but one points the direction to deeper understanding. With this general philosophy set, we can now explore how Mystrikism applies it across different domains, from the enigma of consciousness to the evolution of morality. We will see emergent wholes interpreted through reductionist parts in each case, and how mystriks navigate the insights and pitfalls of each stance. Emergentism and Reductionism, a Mystrikal Perspective, Part 5 of 11. Consciousness, mind as an emergence of matter. Perhaps no phenomenon feels more emergent, even enigmatic, than consciousness. Our subjective awareness, with its rich qualia and sense of self, has long been termed the hard problem in philosophy. Throughout history, many have doubted that mere physical matter could ever give rise to the glow of mental experience. Spiritual traditions posited immaterial souls. Even some scientists have flirted with dualism, mind and matter as separate, or with panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental property pervading all matter. Mystrikism approaches consciousness with both open-minded curiosity and firm naturalism. The stance is that consciousness is an emergent property of complex biological processes, especially the neural networks in our brains. In plainer terms, the mind arises from matter when matter is organized in particularly intricate ways. The evidence overwhelmingly supports this view. We can alter or abolish consciousness by manipulating the brain, with drugs, injuries, stimulation, demonstrating that mental states depend on physical states. Thus, mystriks see no need to invoke a separate spirit or a magical spark to animate the mind. The brain is an electrochemical organ, and somehow those electrochemical signals, when sufficiently networked, produce the subjective theater of the mind. This is an epistemologically emergent story. We do not yet fully understand how the signals become the movie of consciousness, so we label it emergent and investigate further. But ontologically, Mystrikism is confident that nothing supernatural is at work. To quote a line from a famous biologist, "You're nothing but a pack of neurons." That cheeky remark by Francis Crick, co-discoverer of DNA, was meant to jolt us into recognizing that our entire rich inner life is, at root, the activity of nerve cells. A mystrik would add, "And isn't that astonishing? It's not depressing that neurons create consciousness. It's wondrous that the laws of physics have orchestrated matter into such a self-aware symphony." Mystrikism rejects panpsychism firmly, despite finding it entertaining speculation, because there is no empirical evidence that inert matter has any conscious experience at all. The allure of panpsychism is that it tries to solve the hard problem by simply declaring consciousness a fundamental feature of reality, like mass or charge, present in all things to some degree. But mystics point out that this doesn't actually explain consciousness, it just disperses the mystery into every electron and grain of sand. Moreover, it's not testable or supported by evidence. Nothing in physics or neuroscience suggests that an atom has a tiny spark of experience. So, while keeping an open mind, if some evidence of mind-matter dual properties emerged, they'd study it. Mystrikism currently views panpsychism as an unnecessary leap beyond data. Instead, mystics invest hope in fields like cognitive neuroscience, complexity theory, and information theory to gradually crack the puzzle of consciousness in reductionist terms. For example, by identifying how certain neural circuits correlate with self-awareness, or how integrated information might reach a threshold that yields the subjective I. On the other side of the aisle, Mystrikism also counters theological interpretations of consciousness. Many religions hold that the mind, or soul, is a gift from a god, something breathed into humans that sets us apart from mere matter. In such views, consciousness might be seen as evidence of a divine spark, a case where the whole truly transcends the parts by design. Mystics, committed to naturalism, respond that this is an argument from ignorance. Just because we don't yet know how neurons produce the mind doesn't mean we should insert a ghost or a god into the explanation. History has repeatedly seen God of the gaps arguments falter as gaps closed. Mystics expect the same here. They note, for instance, that damage to specific brain areas can erase specific mental capacities, like language or memory, which is strange if a unified soul were solely responsible for those faculties. The more we map the brain, the more the so-called soul appears to be a constellation of brain processes. Mystrikism finds it more parsimonious that consciousness emerged gradually in the evolution of nervous systems, conferring survival advantages rather than being inserted whole cloth by a deity at some point. We can even see rudiments of consciousness in animals, the spectrum from simple stimulus response in an insect to perhaps genuine self-awareness in chimps or dolphins. This continuity fits better with an emergent natural view than with a binary divine impartation. In Mystrikal discourse, you might hear an analogy. The mind is to the brain as a rainbow is to raindrops, a beautiful emergent effect of many tiny interactions, not a thing floating by itself. Just as a rainbow emerges from water droplets and sunlight and disappears if the physical conditions change, consciousness emerges from neurons and their firing patterns and flickers or fades if those patterns are disrupted. Seeing it this way doesn't cheapen the rainbow or the mind. It just roots these phenomena in nature's grandeur. And since Mystrikism holds reverence for the infinite unknown, it finds the brain to be one of the most awe-inspiring unknowns of all. The complexity of 86 billion neurons weaving the fabric of a life's experience is mind-boggling, quite literally. Mystics are fascinated by this emergent story and eager participants in its unraveling. They anticipate that as neuroscience advances, it will detail the step-by-step of consciousness, perhaps even replicate aspects of it in AI or simulations, offering a reductionist explanation that still leaves us marveling at how astonishing it is that atoms, in combination, can do that. Consciousness is treated as an epistemologically, not ontologically, emergent phenomenon, a complex result of physical processes in the brain and nervous system. It's a challenge to our understanding, but not a violation of our naturalistic creed. In closing this section, let's recall the humanistic side. Recognizing the mind as an emergent property of matter can instill a sense of kinship and responsibility. If mind is a natural phenomenon, then it likely abides by cause and effect. Mental illnesses have biochemical roots, meaning we can treat them. Our sense of self can be understood and perhaps improved or extended through science. And crucially, if consciousness arises under certain conditions, it suggests we are not metaphysically notable exceptions, but rather part of the continuum of nature. This humbles us and also raises ethical considerations. If certain animals show significant signs of consciousness, we owe them moral regard as fellow emergent minds. Mystrikism's reductionist emergent view of consciousness thus reinforces both a pursuit of knowledge and a compassionate outlook toward other sentient life. It's a beautiful example of how understanding the parts, neurons, biology, informs our valuation of the emergent whole, a conscious being with feelings. Emergentism and Reductionism, a Mystrikal Perspective, Part 6 of 11. Life and Biology, From Chemistry to the Magic of Life. Life itself was long considered a mystery that mere chemicals could never explain. Ancient thinkers believed in a vital essence or elan vital, some spark of life force that living beings had and inanimate matter lacked. In the 19th century, this view, known as vitalism, began to crumble as scientists synthesized organic molecules from inorganic ones, and Darwin unveiled how the complexity of organisms could arise gradually through natural selection. Mystrikism fully embraces the modern scientific consensus. Life is an emergent phenomenon of chemistry, needing no special vital spark or supernatural intervention. The emergence of life is arguably the most profound example of order emerging from chaos, a theme that mystics find deeply awe-inspiring. Simple molecules, given the right environment and energy flows, can self-organize into complex polymers. Some of those polymers can become self-replicating, like RNA, and from that humble beginning, evolution by natural selection can eventually produce cells, multicellular organisms, and the entire teeming biosphere we see today. This bottom-up explanation is reductionist, as it posits no additional forces beyond those of physics and chemistry. Yet it yields something genuinely new, the self-sustaining, reproducing, adaptive complexity that defines life. Mystics often highlight evolution as the master class in emergent complexity. Starting from single-celled organisms billions of years ago, life diversified and complexified, not by any guiding hand, but by the accumulation of changes filtered by survival and reproduction. The results, whether the iridescent wing of a butterfly or the intricate ecology of a coral reef, can feel purposeful or designed, but Mystrikism joins scientists like Richard Dawkins in asserting that this is the blind watchmaker at work. There is no need to invoke an external designer when natural selection and deep time can do the job. To quote Theodosius Dobzhansky, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." Through that light, the emergence of elaborate biological forms is illuminated as an expected outcome of simple rules, variation, heredity, and selection, iterated over aeons. In Mystrikal terms, the beauty and diversity of life are astonishing products of physical processes, including genetic mutations, physical changes in DNA, and ecological interactions, physical challenges to survival. The awe remains, even increases when we understand this. As Darwin himself wrote in the stirring final passage of On the Origin of Species, "From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful have been, and are being evolved." In that sentence, Darwin captures the emergent splendor, the endless beautiful forms, arising from the reductionist basis, a simple beginning with perhaps one or a few original life forms and simple laws of variation and inheritance. Mystrikism also uses the story of life's emergence to reinforce its non-supernatural stance. Many religious narratives insert miracles into the origin of life, a divine spark that ignited the first cell, or a creator specially designing each species. Mystics point out that every attempt to find a shortcut in life's history has either failed or been pushed further back. Lightning and atmospheric gases can produce amino acids, Miller-Urey experiment, showing life's building blocks form naturally. Self-assembling molecules like lipids form cell-like membranes spontaneously in water. No fossil or genetic evidence indicates a sudden hand of a god event. Instead, we see gradual transitions, for example, feathered dinosaurs transitioning into birds or ape-like ancestors into humans. The reductionist program in biology has been astoundingly successful. We've mapped DNA, showing the code of life is literally chemistry. We've understood metabolism as chemistry. We use physical drugs to alter biological processes, etc. At this point, claiming life has an extra supernatural ingredient is as unnecessary as suggesting that planets need angels to push them in orbit. Natural laws suffice. That said, life does pose some of science's great unsolved questions. For example, how exactly did life begin from non-life, the abiogenesis problem? Mystriks label these as emergent puzzles, not as evidence for supernatural intervention. The origin of life is an emergent threshold where chemistry became biology. It's hard to replicate or fully explain yet, but it doesn't require positing a ghost in the test tube. Researchers make progress each year in understanding prebiotic chemistry, and Mystriks are confident that eventually a plausible natural path from chemical soups to the first microbe will be charted. They are comfortable saying, "We don't know yet," and revering that unknown rather than grasping at metaphysical straws. In living organisms, we also encounter the concept of teleology, purpose. Biological features often seem designed for a purpose: eyes for seeing, wings for flying. Emergentism here reminds us that this purposefulness is itself emergent and apparent. Eyes evolved because creatures with light-sensitive patches survived better, incrementally improving over generations. Not because evolution had a plan, but because of cumulative selection. So the purpose in biology is retrospective. It emerges from what works, not from foresight. Mystrikism enjoys such explanations because they take something humans used to invoke a god for, "What is the purpose of this?" and answer it with a natural principle. It appears purposeful because of selection for function, but no external purpose are needed. In that sense, evolution is a reductionist's dream and a theologian's headache. It explains the emergence of organized complexity through simple rules, no miracles included. Mystriks, of course, side with the reductionist view and see evolution itself as one of nature's most awe-inspiring processes. Another emergent phenomenon in biology is consciousness, which we addressed separately, but we can note here that humans are part of the biological continuum. The human mind emerging from the brain is a late chapter in the grand story of life's emergence from simple beginnings. To emphasize this evolutionary continuity, consider a concise phylogenetic timeline, starting with early life forms such as single-celled organisms, evolving into increasingly complex multicellular life, leading to early vertebrates and mammals, and eventually to primates and Homo sapiens. Mystrikism stresses this continuity. No abrupt supernatural leap separates us from the rest of life. We are extraordinary, yes, but explainably so. Our capacities emerged from those of our ancestors along this continuum. Understanding this fosters a sense of kinship with other animals. We share a common origin, and deepens ethical naturalism. We see rudiments of empathy, cooperation in other social animals, suggesting morality's roots are biological. More on that soon. Finally, let's consider the phenomenon of the spark of life in everyday terms. A human being is made of atoms of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, etc., which themselves obey physics. Yet, when arranged as a living body, these atoms partake in something profoundly different from when they are in a rock: metabolism, growth, reproduction, sensation. Life is emergent in that respect. But reductionism reminds us that if we had perfect knowledge, we could, in principle, map each atom's motion and the chemical reactions in a cell and see no laws broken. The challenge is that even a single cell contains trillions of atoms. It's practically impossible to simulate that in full right now, but conceptually, nothing except complexity stops us. Mystrikism holds that complexity does not imply the supernatural. It means patience and powerful tools. Already, fields like systems biology and synthetic biology are making headway in dissecting life's complexity and even recreating aspects of life artificially. For example, minimal synthetic cells, gene editing, and the construction of new functions. These achievements bolster Mystrikism's confidence that life's emergence can be understood mechanistically. In sum, Mystrikism views biology as an epic of emergent complexity, driven by mindless, natural processes. It's an epic that commands reverence. Indeed, many mystrics speak of nature's creativity and the miracle of life almost religiously, quickly adding that it's a miracle in the figurative sense only. A flower blooming is beautiful not because a fairy makes it bloom, but because countless molecules inside the bud interact, cells dividing, hormones flowing, in a dance choreographed by evolution and DNA. Knowing the choreography doesn't dull the beauty. It might make us gasp with greater admiration. The Mystrikal tone encourages exactly that. Let understanding deepen your awe. Life's reductionist explanation, as a chemical code and an evolutionary algorithm, is itself poetic, a testament to what blind nature can yield over time. If that isn't worthy of reverence, what is? Emergentism and Reductionism, a Mystrikal Perspective, Part 7 of 11. Society and culture, individuals, networks, and emergent order. Zooming out from individual organisms, we arrive at society and culture, which introduce another layer of emergent phenomena. A single human is complex. A million humans interacting create complexities of a wholly different order: economies, languages, civilizations, the Internet. Mystrikism, consistent with its naturalistic stance, treats societies as natural phenomena that emerge from the interactions of individuals without invoking mystical collective spirits or destinies. There is a temptation in some ideologies to treat a nation or society as if it had its own consciousness or fate, for example, speaking of a national spirit or the soul of a people. Mystriks avoid such reifications. They see these as poetic metaphors at best, not literal entities. Society is emergent, yes, in that it has properties no individual has. No single person has a language, but a community does. No single person constitutes an economy, but together, trade emerges. Yet all those emergent social facts ultimately supervene on individual thoughts, communications, and actions. A concrete example: language. Language is an emergent cultural phenomenon. It evolves and exists only in a population that shares it. No one person can have a private language in the full sense. It's more than the sum of individual vocabularies. It includes shared rules, meanings, and nuances that arise through collective use. But there's nothing mystical about language's existence. It's a product of many brains interacting over time, subject to social and cognitive forces, such as ease of pronunciation, the utility of certain words, etc. Mystrikism would analyze language emergence through linguistics, sound changes, grammaticalization, etc., essentially a reductionist approach to a complex adaptive system. Another example: markets and economies. Adam Smith famously described how individuals pursuing their own gain can, as if by an invisible hand, lead to overall social benefit, under some conditions. That invisible hand is an emergent order. No one intends the complex outcomes, yet they arise from aggregate behavior. Modern complexity economics and network theory explore these emergent orders without assuming any guiding hand, literal or divine. For mystriks, the invisible hand is just a metaphor for emergent self-organization. They would extend this to other phenomena, such as traffic flow. Emergent patterns of jams and oscillations form from individual driving decisions, or the growth of cities. Urban patterns emerge without a central planner from many local actions. One area where emergent social phenomena become particularly meaningful is morality and norms, which we will discuss separately in the next section. But in general, Mystrikism sees human culture as an evolving emergent system, akin to the evolution of a living organism, but happening in the realm of ideas, memes, if you will. There's a parallel here. Just as life's diversity emerged via natural selection, cultural diversity and complexity emerge via an evolution of ideas, practices, and technologies, shaped by human needs and preferences, selection pressures of a sort. Crucially, no supernatural guidance is assumed in Mystrikism's view of history or culture. History has trends and trajectories, but they are driven by human psychology, environmental factors, chance events, not by destiny or a metaphysical purpose. This aligns with what many historians and anthropologists find: complex social structures, such as religions, governments, and economies, can be explained by material and psychological causes, geography, inventions, conflicts, and cooperation dynamics, rather than by the claim that a particular empire was meant to rise or fall. That said, society often exhibits holistic properties that challenge reductionist simplifications. For instance, if you analyze individuals separately, you might miss phenomena such as mob behavior or culture, which arise from interactions. Mystrikism acknowledges the need for holistic models. For example, sociology uses concepts such as social networks and institutions that aren't reducible to a single person's traits. But again, they stress that these holistic descriptors are conveniences. At root, a mob behaves as it does because of many individual decisions influenced by crowd psychology, which itself is a science connecting individual psychology with group context. There's no group mind separate from the members. This stance is closely related to methodological individualism in social science, tempered by the understanding that individuals themselves are influenced by emergent structures, like being raised in a culture shapes one's preferences, a feedback loop of emergence. Consider social media as a vivid illustration. Algorithms curate content based on user behavior, yet they also shape that behavior by determining what content is most visible and engaging. This demonstrates a dynamic feedback loop in which individual actions and larger structural forces continuously influence one another, highlighting the bidirectional nature of social emergence. Another interesting point: some philosophies, and especially mystical or New Age ideas, flirt with the notion of a collective consciousness, that humanity, or all life forms, is an overarching mind or spiritual entity. Mystrikism does not endorse this literal notion. Figuratively, one might say, we are all connected, to convey ecological and social interdependence, a view with which mystics would agree. But they wouldn't posit an actual global brain or consciousness that we tap into, as in Teilhard de Chardin's concept of the noosphere or specific interpretations of the Gaia hypothesis. Gaia hypothesis, for example, initially proposed by James Lovelock, suggested that Earth's biosphere behaves like a single self-regulating organism. Mystrikism would interpret that charitably as a sound systems metaphor. Life and Earth co-evolve and stabilize certain conditions, like oxygen levels, in a quasi-homeostasis. But they'd reject any implication of Gaia having intent or consciousness. It's emergent order, yes. Feedback loops can make Earth's climate somewhat self-correcting, but it's not evidence of Earth as a sentient being. In sum, at the social level, Mystrikism continues its theme. Order and complexity emerge naturally from simpler elements following understandable principles. Whether it's cooperation emerging from self-interest, game theory shows how even selfish agents can evolve cooperation through repeated interactions, or culture emerging from individuals learning and imitating one another, none of it requires a supernatural push. And, as with other emergent phenomena, understanding the mechanics can lead to better outcomes. For instance, if we realize that polarization in society emerges partly from social network echo chambers, an emergent information cascade, we can mitigate it by changing how information flows. This is the practical payoff of a reductionist approach to emergent social issues. By identifying the micro-mechanisms, we can intervene at that level to change the macro outcome. Mystriks also tend to be optimistic that knowledge can help shape emergent social outcomes for the better, precisely because there's no mysterious fate, but rather patterns we can learn and influence. This aligns with the movement's ethical emphasis on improving well-being through rational means. A society is not a capricious god. It's a human construct that can be reformed with human intelligence and empathy. That is an empowering thought. It means we are not at the mercy of some mystical zeitgeist, but rather participants in a large, complex game whose rules we can study and gradually improve. Lastly, consider how Mystrikism's view contrasts with a theological one in this domain. Some religious outlooks see societies as guided by divine providence or judged by divine standards. For example, a god will bless a nation that follows him, etc. Mystrikism rejects any such supernatural oversight. If an empire falls, look to economics, moral decay, resource depletion, war, not to a god's anger. If a social movement succeeds, credit human ideals and effort, not divine mandate. This doesn't make social change any less meaningful. In fact, it puts the responsibility squarely on our shoulders. We can't say, a god will fix society, or, it's destined anyway. Instead, it's, we collectively will shape society, and emergent outcomes will reflect our actions. That's a call to mindful action in the face of uncertainty, very much in line with Mystrikal ethics. Emergentism and Reductionism, a Mystrikal Perspective, Part 8 of 11. Morality and Meaning, Emergent Ethics in a Natural World. Morality is a domain where people have often assumed a supernatural element, be it a god's commandments, cosmic justice, or karmic balance. Mystrikism takes a bold and refreshing stand. Morality is an emergent feature of the natural world, specifically of human nature and the realities of suffering and flourishing. In other words, ethics arise from the interactions of conscious creatures trying to live together, not from any outside instruction. This stance is known as ethical naturalism, and mystrics vigorously champion it. We do not need a deity to tell us what is right or wrong. Instead, notions of good and evil emerge from the observable impact of actions on well-being. If kindness tends to produce happiness and social harmony, we naturally come to call it good. If theft and violence cause suffering and chaos, we label them bad. Over time, these shared conclusions become moral norms, often codified in cultural rules or laws. But their root is in our nature. Humans, and other social animals, have empathy. We can feel pain and pleasure, and we have reason to extrapolate consequences. From those ingredients, morality blossoms as a social technology to maximize our flourishing and minimize our suffering. Cross-cultural research supports this view, showing that many moral values are shared across societies. Studies on primates, for instance, reveal behaviors such as empathy and cooperation, suggesting evolutionary roots to these moral tendencies. One such study in chimpanzees demonstrated that they would often share food with their companions, a behavior that echoes human notions of fairness and sharing. Mystrikism's emergent view of morality aligns with thinkers such as the philosopher David Hume, who argued that our moral sentiments arise from human nature, and biologists such as E.O. Wilson, who saw the evolutionary roots of social behavior. It also resonates with contemporary proponents of a science of morality, such as Sam Harris, who argues that facts about the well-being of conscious creatures can inform objective morals. A mystrik might point out, for example, that altruism can be observed in rudimentary form in other animals. Apes console each other, wolves cooperate, dolphins support sick companions. These behaviors hint that our moral instincts are an emergent product of evolution. Species that live in groups develop behaviors and corresponding emotions that help the group thrive, because groups that do so outcompete nastier, less cooperative ones. So, evolution programmed empathy and fairness into us at a basic level, not perfectly, but as tendencies. Culture and reason then build on that, refining moral systems over centuries. But nowhere in this story do we need to appeal to a holy book or a divine spark. This approach naturally contrasts with religious morality. In religious contexts, morality is often portrayed as handed down from a supernatural source, for example, a god's commandments in a holy document. Mystrikism rejects that on multiple grounds. First, the plurality of moral codes in world cultures, often conflicting on specifics, is better explained by different social environments and histories than by multiple gods issuing edicts. Second, even religious people tend, in practice, to use reason and empathy to judge morals. For instance, many today reject archaic scriptural injunctions, like stoning adulterers, because by our natural lights we see it as cruel, regardless of divine endorsement. That implies our moral sense stands apart from Scripture. It emerged from human considerations. Mystriks would say the progress we've made in morality, for example, abolishing slavery, expanding human rights, has come not from new divine revelations, but from humans applying empathy and rational thinking to social conditions, an emergent, bottom-up process of ethical improvement. Mystrikal ethics focuses a lot on consequences. This is a broadly utilitarian or pragmatic streak. It asks, what actions lead to suffering and what lead to flourishing? Those questions can, in principle, be studied with the tools of science, psychology experiments, sociology studies, etc. In that sense, morality is seen as an emergent science of well-being. It's not as exact as physics, of course. Still, the idea is that moral truths, like unnecessary cruelty is wrong, are true because of natural facts. Cruelty causes harm. Humans and animals dislike pain. Societies full of cruelty collapse or are miserable. Thus, moral principles emerge from reality itself. We discover them somewhat the way we find out medicine, by understanding cause and effect in human life. This is a dynamic view. As we learn more, say, find that a particular punitive policy causes more crime and suffering, we adjust our moral stance, perhaps shifting from punishment to rehabilitation. Mystrikism is very comfortable with this evolving, evidence-informed morality. It stands in contrast to any notion of fixed, eternal decrees. Far from seeing that as a weakness, mystriks see it as a strength. We aren't chained to ancient rules. We are free to improve our ethical understanding as our knowledge grows. Another emergent aspect of morality is cultural values. Different societies develop different norms. For example, some cultures highly value filial piety, respect for elders, while others value individual freedom more. These can be seen as emergent solutions to local circumstances or historical contexts. Mystrikism respects cultural diversity, but also believes in a core of morality rooted in the common nature of humanity. No matter the culture, cruelty, betrayal, and arbitrary violence tend to be seen negatively once people think them through, because the underlying impact is negative. And virtues like honesty and kindness are often lauded because they reliably produce trust and happiness. So, mystriks would argue there is an objective basis, the well-being of conscious creatures, that underpins morality, even as the expression of that basis can vary. The emergent view here is that morality arises from human nature interacting with the environment. Though the flowers of morality might be diverse, the soil, human nature, has common elements across our species. Because morality is emergent, Mystrikism also tends to support the idea that we can use rational discourse to improve it. We can reason about ethical dilemmas, appeal to facts about consequences, and come to better solutions. There's nothing mystically unknowable about ethics. It's hard, yes, because human life is complex and our information is incomplete, but it's in the domain of understandable problems. Compare that to a worldview where morality is just obedience to divine will. In that view, without a God's revelation, we'd be lost. Mystriks say, no, we have the tools within us, empathy, reason, shared human experience, to figure this out, however imperfectly. This is a very empowering and humbling stance, empowering because it's up to us, we are the authors of morality, and humbling because it means that if the world is unjust, we can't blame it on anything but our own failings, and we must strive to fix it. A practical upshot of emergent naturalistic ethics is the emphasis on harm reduction and well-being. Mystrikism often frames moral questions in terms of reducing suffering and increasing flourishing for not only humans, but all sentient beings. This leads to a broad compassion for animals, since they feel pain and emotions to varying degrees. For the environment, since destroying ecosystems ultimately causes suffering to countless creatures, including us, and for future generations. None of these concerns requires a supernatural belief. They emerge logically once you value well-being naturally. For example, environmental stewardship can be seen as emergent moral insight. Initially, a society might not think dumping waste is immoral, but as we understand the consequences, pollution harms health, future generations suffer, a moral norm against pollution emerges. It's not delivered by thunderbolt from Zeus. It's learned by evidence and empathy. Does Mystrikism allow for any higher meaning or purpose beyond what nature provides? In a world of pure naturalism, isn't there a risk of nihilism if everything is just atoms and void? Mystrikism addresses this by reframing meaning as itself an emergent property. Purpose is not handed down from on high. It emerges from our values, relationships, and aspirations. We create meaning by choosing what to care about and pursue. For a Mystrik, the lack of cosmic predestined purpose is not depressing. It's liberating and motivating. It means we are the authors of meaning in our lives. Our sense of purpose might emerge from our evolutionary drives to love, to create, to explore. But we can reflect on those and embrace them consciously. A Mystrik might say the universe has no inherent meaning, but we are meaning generators within it. That is a profoundly beautiful emergent fact. Little lumps of carbon, humans, have arranged themselves into beings that dream, hope, and assign significance to things. It's like the universe woke up through us and now experiences itself with intention. Carl Sagan phrased something similar. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. That line captures how a reductionist fact, we are made of cosmos, and an emergent reality, we have knowledge, combine into a meaningful perspective. In conclusion, morality and meaning in Mystrikism stand as a testament to the emergent capacities of natural beings. We evolved not only to survive, but to care and to question. Ethics is the blossoming of primal instincts into principles of justice and kindness, guided by reason. Purpose is the bloom of conscious reflection on the raw fact of existence. None of this requires myths about immortal souls or divine plans, and yet it fulfills much of what those myths aim to provide: a guide to live a good life, a reason to treat each other well, and a sense of belonging to something larger, in our case, the community of life and the ongoing adventure of the cosmos. Mystrikism finds that reverence for the infinite unknown is helpful here again. We do good and seek meaning while humbly aware that we don't have all the answers. We strive, guided by evidence and empathy, refining our emergent moral compass as we go. In a way, we co-create morality in the same way we co-create a culture or a language, organically over time, through trial and error and shared experience. This makes morality a living, breathing aspect of the natural world, one which merits our respect and careful tending, just like a garden we hope to see flourish. Emergentism and Reductionism, a Mystrikal Perspective, Part 9 of 11. Physics and Cosmology, Fundamental Reductions and Emergent Realities. Finally, we turn to the most fundamental level of understanding, physics and the cosmos at large. At first glance, physics is all reductionism and no emergence. After all, physics seeks the fundamental laws of nature, the ultimate building blocks like quarks, electrons, and forces. And indeed, Mystrikism is thoroughly on board with the reductionist triumphs of physics, the standard model of particle physics, the laws of electromagnetism, gravity, and quantum mechanics. These are the bedrock explanations for how matter and energy behave. In principle, if you know the physics of all particles, you could derive everything else, That's the dream of a theory of everything. However, even within physics and cosmology, scientists recognize emergent phenomena. A classic example is temperature, an emergent concept, since a single atom doesn't have a temperature. Temperature makes sense only as an average kinetic energy of a vast number of atoms. To bridge these concepts to everyday experience, consider the smartphone in your hand. Though it feels solid to the touch, it is composed mostly of empty space between atoms. This solidity emerges from the electromagnetic forces and quantum rules among countless atoms in its structure, transforming a collection of particles into a tangible, functional device. Similarly, concepts like pressure emerge from particle collisions and are not present at the particle level, but instead become real at aggregate scales. Mystrikism delights in these examples because they illustrate again that more is different. New properties appear at higher complexity, but none of them violate or escape the lower-level rules. There's no mysterious new force that makes a gas exert pressure. It's the collective result of countless molecules bouncing around. This pattern holds true up the chain. Chemical properties, like wetness of water or the reactive behavior of an acid, emerge from physical interactions of atoms. Biological properties arise from chemicals, consciousness from biological networks, and so on. Physics is the foundation, but by the time we reach living or cosmic scales, we often need new descriptive frameworks. You wouldn't calculate human history with quantum equations, even though, in principle, human bodies obey quantum physics. Mystrikism understands this as the hierarchy of science. Each level, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology, has its own emergent regularities, which we treat with some autonomy. But that independence is one of convenience and complexity, not of separate existence. We still believe microphysical processes are implementing a sociological phenomenon. Currently, we can't track all of them, so we treat the emergent level on its own terms. In cosmology, emergence shows up in the formation of large-scale structures. After the Big Bang, the universe was just a hot soup of particles, pretty reductionist chaos. But gravity, a simple fundamental force, gradually pulled matter into clumps, which became stars, galaxies, clusters, creating the beautiful hierarchical structure of the cosmos we see today. One might say galaxies are emergent structures from gravitational dynamics. They even exhibit emergent behaviors, spiral density waves that make spiral arms, for instance, or the way galactic ecosystems cycle gas through star formation and supernova. Again, nothing supernatural, just lots of pieces interacting. But the outcome is something like the Milky Way, with patterns and perhaps even a kind of life cycle, forming, evolving, possibly dying in the distant future. Another fascinating frontier is how space and time themselves may be emergent in some modern physics theories. For example, specific approaches to quantum gravity, like string theory or quantum entanglement hypotheses, suggest that space-time geometry might emerge from more fundamental quantum information. This is highly speculative and cutting-edge, but it shows that even at the bedrock, physicists are entertaining the idea that what we consider fundamental, space, time, might actually be emergent from something deeper, maybe a network of entangled bits. Mystrikism, while not presuming to solve quantum gravity, is certainly intrigued by the idea that the pattern of emergence might be fractal. It could go all the way down and all the way up. At every scale, new, effective laws appear that make sense at that scale, derived from lower scales. For instance, the smooth fabric of spacetime emerges from the grainy quantum level, like a fluid's smooth flow emerges from molecular chaos. If this holds true, then reductionism is always the guide to get to the next layer down. But there may always be another emergent layer below, until we truly hit the rock bottom of reality, if there is one. Regardless, the process of science is to keep peeling those layers. Does Mystrikism expect everything to reduce nicely? Are there any candidates for truly irreducible emergent laws that are independent? The stance is that even if our human minds need emergent laws, like thermodynamics, to work with, those laws are statistical summaries of underlying laws. For example, the second law of thermodynamics, entropy tends to increase, is a fundamental seeming principle, but it's actually emergent from the statistical properties of particle motion. It's not separate from particle physics. It's a consequence of it. This reinforces the viewpoint that reductionism undergirds even emergent regularities. Another concept often discussed is determinism versus free will, which ties physics to human-level questions. If everything reduces to physical law, is free will an illusion? Mystrikism tends toward a compatibilist view, though individuals might have nuanced opinions. Basically, yes, in a strict sense, our decisions are products of brain chemistry responding to inputs. So, at a physical level, they're determined, or probabilistic if quantum effects matter. But free will, as we experience it, is an emergent phenomenon of our complex brains making choices, and it remains meaningful at that emergent level. We feel deliberation. We can change based on reasoning, etc. Mystriks often say we should live as if we have free will and are responsible, because that emergent perspective is practically valid, even if philosophically we know it's underpinned by causal chains. This again shows comfort with multiple levels of description. We don't have to choose one and deny the reality of the other. We can say, free will is how decision-making feels from the inside when a brain with certain complexity performs choices, an emergent self-description of a deterministic system. This is how a mystrik might reconcile everyday experience with reductionist philosophy. One more interplay of reductionism and awe in cosmology. Consider the concept of a unified theory, the reductionist dream, one equation to rule them all. If scientists find it, would that make everything trivial? Mystriks doubt it. As the physicist Stephen Hawking once mused, even if we had a theory of everything, we would still have to understand the 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, 10 to the 80 particles worth of stuff the theory applies to. In other words, the equation might be simple, but its solutions, our universe's actual state, are complex. And beyond that, we'd still have the emergent questions. How does that theory produce life, mind, beauty? So far from ending wonder, a final physical theory might mark a new beginning of understanding emergent phenomena on a fully known foundation. Imagine the joy of truly knowing the rules of the game and then exploring all the patterns they can produce. That's a very mystical aspiration, combining ultimate reductionism with ultimate curiosity about emergence. In wrapping up this section, it's worth highlighting a quote that mystics admire by J.B.S. Haldane. The universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. This captures the humbling idea that no matter how deep our reductionist knowledge goes, reality's layers of emergent strangeness may never end. There will always be new surprises as systems combine into forms beyond previous imagination. Mystrikism takes this not as a defeat, but as inspiration, an infinite unknown to revere, yet bit by bit to illuminate. Physics gives us the laws, but those laws allowed galaxies, stars, planets, life, and consciousness to emerge, a cascade of wonders from quarks to poets. It's hard to imagine a more awe-inspiring narrative, and it's entirely naturalistic. In the grand sense, one can even say the cosmos itself is an emergent unfolding, from a near-uniform fireball at the Big Bang to the richly structured cosmos now. Complexity continues to increase in pockets, even as overall entropy increases. We, as thinking beings, are part of that increase in local complexity. Mystrikism finds profound meaning in viewing the human quest for knowledge as the universe, through us, turning back to understand itself. And it affirms that we do so not by denying our material nature, but by embracing it entirely, because it is from matter and energy that this capacity for reflection and awe has emerged. Emergentism and Reductionism, a Mystrikal Perspective, Part 10 of 11. Contrasts with other philosophical perspectives. It's illuminating to place Mystrikism's approach to emergentism and reductionism alongside a few other worldviews. Scientific materialism, physicalism, Mystrikism is, in essence, a form of scientific materialism. It agrees that only matter-energy and their interactions exist, and everything must be explained in those terms. Where it distinguishes itself is in tone and emphasis. Some caricatures of materialism portray it as cold or dismissive of human experience. We're nothing but atoms, so love or beauty are illusions. Mystrikism explicitly rejects that nihilistic streak. Instead, it insists that understanding our nothing but atoms nature heightens our appreciation for love and beauty, precisely because they are rare emergent phenomena of those atoms. Unlike a purely reductionist materialist who might say that emergent properties are irrelevant epiphenomena, Mystrikism holds that they are significant consequences of material reality. In practice, this aligns Mystriks with thinkers like Carl Sagan, who was a materialist in ontology but almost spiritual, in quotes, in his reverence for the material processes that produce them. A strict materialist might also eschew any talk of spirituality, in quotes, or higher power, even metaphorically. In contrast, Mystrikism comfortably uses such language, carefully qualified with naturalism, to express the emotional significance of the unknown. So one could say Mystrikism is materialism with a soul, not a literal soul, but a poetic human depth. This makes it more palatable to those who fear that materialism is dehumanizing. In content, there's no difference. Both deny the supernatural, both trust reductionist science. In spirit, Mystrikism reclaims wonder and morality as natural phenomena to be treasured, whereas old-school materialism sometimes ignores those aspects. Panpsychism and idealism. We touched on panpsychism earlier, the idea that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous. Idealism is the broader view that the mind or spirit is the primary substance, and that matter might even be a manifestation of the mind. These views are, in a way, the polar opposite of reductionist physicalism. Mystrikism rejects them for lack of evidence and for adding unnecessary complexity to explanations. The world behaves exactly as we'd expect if matter is mindless, except when organized in very special ways. There's no hint, for example, that electrons make choices or experience qualia. Their behavior is fully explained by physical laws without mental attributes. Panpsychists often argue that physicalism can't explain consciousness, so they propose that consciousness is everywhere. Mystriks argue back that just because we don't yet have a full explanation doesn't mean we should flip the ontology. They see panpsychism as a kind of neo-vitalism for mind, an appealing but speculative leap beyond what data support. Mystrikism also values falsifiability. Panpsychism is notoriously unfalsifiable. If everything has consciousness, how do you prove or disprove it? If a rock is conscious in some invisible way, no experiment can confirm that. Mystriks prefer to stay grounded in what can be tested and observed. Similarly, idealistic monism, all is mind, or dual aspect theories, mind and matter are two sides of one coin, are seen as conjectures that complicate the picture without predictive power. They might be interesting philosophically, but Mystrikism's attitude is that unless such theories yield some empirical handle, they remain speculative metaphysics one should not commit to. Instead, stick with what has worked, a reductionist physicalist approach, and see how far it can go. So far, it has an excellent track record. Holism and New Age spirituality. There are philosophical and spiritual movements that champion holism. The idea that wholes are primary, and perhaps that the universe is an interconnected whole with its own quasi-consciousness. The New Age slogan, "Everything is one," sometimes veers into mystical claims of a universal consciousness that personal consciousness can tap into. Mystrikism shares a rational version of holism in acknowledging interconnectedness. Ecologically, we're all interdependent. Physically, we all obey the same laws. Socially, our actions affect each other globally. But it stops short of any mystical holism. If someone says, the universe has a plan for you, or we can manifest reality with our thoughts because mind underlies matter, a mystrik will politely disagree. These notions conflict with the evidential, law-bound nature of reality mystriks hold dear. The universe's plan, if any, is just the unfolding of natural laws, which cares not for individual fates except insofar as cause and effect play out. That might sound bleak, but mystriks prefer truth over comforting illusions. The meaning we find in our narrative or our sense of connection with the cosmos is valid as an emergent subjective experience, but not to be mistaken for an objective cosmic teleology. In short, holism as a perspective, looking at whole systems, is fine, even useful. Holism as an ontology, that whole systems have independent agency or spiritual essence, is not supported in Mystrikism. Theological and dualistic views. In religious worldviews, one often finds a different sort of reductionism. Everything is reduced to a god. That is, any complex question, like why consciousness exists, how life arose, or what gives us moral sense, is ultimately answered with, because a god made it so, or it reflects a god's nature. This is a top-down reduction, reducing diverse phenomena to one supreme agency. Mystrikism rejects this for multiple reasons. First, it's not a helpful explanation. Saying, a god did it, doesn't tell you how it was done, and thus doesn't deepen understanding or allow predictions. Whereas scientific reductionism leads to concrete understanding. For example, knowing biochemistry led to medicine, whereas attributing disease to devils did not help cure it. Second, invoking a god often pushes the complexity up a level. If a human mind is so complex it needs a designer, then a god's mind would be even more complicated. So who designed this god? It raises a bigger question than it answers. Mystriks, therefore, see supernatural answers as avoiding the real work of tracing cause and effect in nature. With dualism, mind and matter separate, or body and soul separate, similar issues arise. How does an immaterial soul interact with a material brain? Descartes' old puzzle. No dualist has provided a clear mechanism, whereas the materialist view of mind-brain at least aligns with what neuroscience finds. Electrical stimulation of the brain yields experiences, etc. So, theological and dualistic frameworks are, in Mystrik's judgment, not only unsupported by evidence but also stagnating inquiry. Historically, whenever phenomena were ceded to the unknowable will of a god, scientific progress stalled, only resuming when people assumed there is a natural mechanism to seek. Mystrikism explicitly aligns itself with keeping the flame of inquiry alive and never attributing to the supernatural what can be explained naturally, a principle similar to Laplace's famous response about the lack of need for the God proposition. Doesn't qualify as a hypothesis as it is unfalsifiable in celestial mechanics. This doesn't mean mystriks attack people's faith gratuitously. They don't base their understanding on it. They aim to show that the naturalistic story is not only sufficient, but also more majestic and honest. To paraphrase Dawkins's quote, "The universe has exactly the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, nothing but blind physical forces, and yet look at the beauty those forces have wrought over eons." In place of a divine plan, Mystrikism offers the sublime vision of a self-organizing cosmos. In contrasting these perspectives, it's clear Mystrikism is not a radical outlier, but rather a synthesis and humanization of a scientific worldview. It stands very much in line with mainstream secular scientific thought, physicalism, evolution, secular ethics. Still, it repackages it in a way that addresses human spiritual, in quotes, and moral yearnings without lapsing into the supernatural. In doing so, it differentiates itself from both ends. from a dry reductionism that fails to inspire, and from a mystical holism that sacrifices rigor. It tries to have the best of both, the intellectual integrity of reductionist science and the heartfelt wonder and meaning often associated with spiritual traditions. Emergentism and Reductionism, a Mystrikal Perspective, Part 11 of 11. A Unity of Understanding and Wonder. Emergentism and reductionism, as treated in Mystrikism, turn out not to be adversaries but partners in the human quest for understanding. Throughout this treatise, we've seen that Mystrikism harmonizes these concepts by remembering the wisdom in both. Look to the parts for the explanation, but cherish the whole for its significance. A Mystrik might say that reductionism gives us the knowledge to answer how, while emergentism ensures we keep asking, why does it matter, and what new wonders arise when things combine. In a Mystrikal worldview, one can revel in the poetic truth that we are stardust contemplating the stars, a line that contains a reduction, stardust, we are made of atoms forged in stars, and an emergence, contemplation, a cognitive miracle of those atoms. There is no contradiction in that duality. It's precisely the union of those perspectives that gives the thought its power. To bring these ideas into your daily life, strive to recognize a single moment each day in which a reductionist insight illuminates your sense of wonder. For instance, when you see the intricate veins of a leaf, consider how the laws of physics and chemistry orchestrate their formation, enhancing your appreciation. This small exercise can transform abstract philosophy into meaningful personal experience, empowering you to live with deeper awareness and intentional curiosity. Mystrikism stands as a modern torchbearer for the worldview championed by thinkers like Carl Sagan, Bertrand Russell, and many others who refuse to accept the choice between science and meaning. It asserts that a scientific, naturalistic universe is not a dead universe, it's a living panorama of emergent complexity. Every reductionist discovery, from the DNA double helix to the quantum behavior of electrons, has eventually opened up new fields of wonder, molecular biology, electronics, you name it, which, in turn, have spawned emergent phenomena and new questions. As our knowledge expands, so does our perimeter of mystery, to paraphrase Einstein or Haldane. Mystriks find that exhilarating. They feel, in a genuine sense, a reverence when faced with facts like the age of the cosmos or the intricacy of a cell. A reverence devoid of superstition, but reverence nonetheless. In the ethical realm, this worldview places responsibility on our shoulders. If everything reduces to natural law and emergent consequence, then our fate is truly in our own hands. No savior or karma will rescue us from climate change or global conflict. Only our understanding of those problems, reductionist analysis, and our emergent collective action, social cooperation, can. That can sound daunting, but it is also empowering and meaningful. It means our choices matter immensely. They ripple through the natural web of cause and effect. It also means small actions can scale up. An emergent property of many people making ethical choices is a better world for all. In that sense, Mystrikism offers people both a realistic outlook and a hopeful call to action. Reality may be indifferent at its core, but within it we can create pockets of care, joy, knowledge, and beauty. The Mystrikal tone throughout is one of an unmistakably human voice, by which we mean a voice that acknowledges human feelings, doubts, and aspirations. We have seen how Mystrikism doesn't shy away from words like mystery, spiritual, in quotes, higher power, metaphorically. It uses them to articulate the human experience of a natural world that is at once intelligible and humbling. Bertrand Russell once noted that love and knowledge, both, were necessary for a good life, and that neither should be sacrificed. In a way, emergentism corresponds to the love of the rich tapestry of existence, and reductionism corresponds to the knowledge of how the threads are woven. Mystrikism marries the two in a philosophy of life that seeks truth through science and meaning, through understanding our place in nature. Standing beneath a night sky, a mystrik doesn't feel small because we're merely matter. Instead, they might feel a profound connection. The iron in our blood was born in supernovae. The photons hitting our eyes traveled light years. We are intimately connected to the cosmos by physical processes. That perspective is available only through reductionist discoveries, yet it triggers what can only be described as an emergent feeling of awe or even transcendence. This is the Mystrikal sweet spot, grounded in reality, but elevated in spirit. In conclusion, Mystrikism's view on emergentism and reductionism teaches us that we need not choose between cold fact and warm meaning. The world can be seen as one grand natural order, where from simplicity springs complexity, and from understanding springs wonder. The emergent and reductionist viewpoints are like two eyes that give us depth perception of truth. With both, our vision is richer. As we continue to explore, Mystriks will carry a toolkit in one hand, the analytical, dissecting mind, and a poem in the other hand, the appreciative, synthesizing heart. And with those, they walk forward, eager to discover how the universe works, and equally keen to be moved by what it reveals. In the words of a modern sage, and in true Mystrikal fashion, we can agree, what a privilege it is to be part of this universe, to study it, to know it, and to feel at home in it. Each of us is a participant in nature's story, an emergent chapter of the cosmos understanding itself, and through Mystrikism's lens, that is more than enough magic, in quotes, for one reality. It is a magic we can trust because it is real.